for each other and that we support each other. And I think with the murder of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of companies and CEOs put very public statements out there, supporting the movement, talking about racial justice, talking about change, and then quickly looked inside internally in the organizations and said, hey, maybe we have some more work to do here. And then I think out of habit, looked at their HR teams. If they don't have a diversity, just mute yourself if you guys join. Looked at their HR teams to say, what do we do next? Or give me an unconscious bias training. And I can speak as an HR professional. I'm not an expert at this. And Angie, if you could just maybe mute folks as they come in, that'd be great. And I know that we were kind of really coming together as a community and asking for help and asking for resources and what are you guys doing? Who has financial support, who doesn't, and how do we kind of navigate this world together? And we are lucky that we have lots of experts just locally here in Austin. And so I'll let Crystal introduce herself first. We have some housekeeping items that we'll do at the end, along with some really great giveaways, but I want to make sure we have enough time as possible. So Crystal, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Of course, thank you so much. Hi, everyone. It's probably a little echoey in the background, and we have this Zoom background going, and on my phone, we closed on our home yesterday, so there is nothing in here. So happy to be here with each of you today. As Samantha mentioned, my name is Crystal Johnson. I've worked in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space for several years. I'm currently working in gaming in the Austin area. I also have an organization called Meaningful that exists to ensure that Black and brown women have the tools and resources they need to navigate, grow, and thrive in corporate spaces. So excited to talk about unconscious bias training today.
And Crystal has a really great podcast if you're interested for learning after. It's We Are Meaningful, correct, Crystal?
It is, yes.
Awesome. And DK, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Awesome.
I was going to say good morning, but maybe you're in California, then it's still morning. But thank you for welcoming me to be a part of this space and to have this conversation today, which I think is really critical. My name is Dr. Kazike Prince. I am the CEO and founder of Jelani Consulting, LLC, based here in Austin, Texas. And I haven't been able to spend as much time on my Equity Turned Up podcast, but I do have an impromptu cooking show called Chopping Up with Kazike, and where we make things like vegan pizza and stuff like that. And then also just launched a Cards for Belonging and Inclusion card deck, and we're starting actually our crowdfunding for that. We did our first printing of the game, and we're having a crowdfunding event launch on October the 1st. And I'll make sure that Samantha and her group have that to share with the rest of you.
I have purchased the cards. I love them. I'm going to use them personally and hopefully at work as well. So definitely check that out. And actually, thank you to our sponsor, or one of our sponsors, Insperity. We'll meet Susan a little bit later on, but we are giving away a digital copy of the cards. So we're super excited that someone's going to be able to leave today with that as well. Awesome. So let's dive right in. Let's start with unconscious bias training. So I know that, and just in kind of my research, right, I think unconscious bias training really was a result from corporations, right? Corporate 500.
Hold on, I can't hear you.
Pushing, really, I would say risk mitigation as a result of the civil rights movement and some of the legislation in the early 60s and 70s. So that's kind of the lens of where unconscious bias started. And then I think in the 1990s, we started hearing about implicit bias training. And I think a lot of folks have done maybe the Harvard implicit bias quiz that's online. When I speak with leaders, they're really interested in that. And then in I would say the 2000s is when we started to have some conversations around, hey, is this really valid? Is this really useful in the workplace? They were having a hard time, I would say, like replicating some of the results. And so as I can speak as an HR professional, we've recently done, we called it a understanding bias course. and our employees, I think, definitely enjoyed it, and it's a great conversational starter, but definitely not a magic bullet to creating change within the organization. And there's definitely some, I would say, kind of pros and cons. And so I'd love to open it up to our panelists, Crystal and Krizike, to kind of just chat about like what have you seen with unconscious bias training? What's worked? What hasn't worked? And what I love about our panelists today is that Krizike definitely approaches this from kind of that consulting, working with leadership in organizations locally, and then Crystal actually does the work internally within her organization. So two very powerful views as we kind of go through this topic.
Crystal, you like to go first?
Sure, totally. I can definitely go first. Thank you so much. So unconscious bias training for me, I think was running rampant for a really long time. And everyone's like, let's do unconscious bias training. It's gonna fix everything. So I think that when organizations think of unconscious bias, as you mentioned, unconscious bias training, as you mentioned, as a magic bullet, they really do themselves a disservice. First, I think that for unconscious bias, people focus more on their intentions rather than the impact of the things that they've done. It can almost sometimes feel like a cop-out, like I'm not conscious of it, so I'm sorry that I did it, I wasn't conscious, let's just move on. So I think that it's okay to have conversations about unconscious bias, understand that unconscious bias exists, but I think we have to move beyond that and consider what is the impact of those actions that you may have done unconsciously, and how are those impacts impacting people in a systemic way, specifically underrepresented talent. So women, Black and brown people, how are your actions impacting them in a systemic way going forward? And how do you mitigate those things that are going on with those groups?
Yeah, I think those are, I'm sorry, Samantha, you were about to say something.
It's all you.
I really appreciate what you're saying, Crystal. I remember my first introduction to unconscious bias was some research about the racism and bias of the well-intentioned. And it was this idea that you're good-natured, mostly white people, who didn't know they were racist. If you asked them, are you racist? Of course they would say, of course not, because it's not socially acceptable, especially today. And so what this research was trying to get at was the racism that you may not be aware of. And here, how can we access what tools can we use to access this unconscious process that's going on? And then one thing, I've done this training before where, you talk about the, 300 billion, things that are going on in your brain all at the same time in any given moment. And your ability to track that information is impossible, hence why it's unconscious, right? There's things going on, influences are going on that just, you can't track. And so for me, it was interesting because now we're talking about brain physiology, we're talking about how the brain works, and now that's the unifying factor, right? Because we're all humans, race is not that important when we're talking about human brains and how they work. And if we acknowledge the kind of humanness of this, it's a unifying factor. And that's the positive aspect of it. It's like, oh, we're humans, we have biases, let's understand those. The challenge with it is that it sometimes becomes a way of whitewashing the conversation. So we're not any longer talking about issues of race and gender and other types of things. It should be, I think, a conduit for the conversation, but sometimes people use it as a way of, well, I mean, I'm just being human. It's not my fault. It's how the brain works, right? And when in actuality, it's because of the social kind of systems that you've been a part of that has trained your brain to be that way. And now we're asking you to be responsible for it in a conscious, intentional way so you can counteract those unconditional, those conditions that have been kind of shaping how you think and see the world. And to be honest, from my perspective, I actually stopped doing unconscious bias training because I felt like what I'm trying to do fundamentally is to raise awareness and consciousness. And unconscious bias training is just one of those tools. But I find that my work is really focusing on people overall, focusing on that awareness building and skills building and other kinds of things that actually, when you look at the research, that's what they're leading to. They're leading to you building skills and awareness and building relationships and doing other kinds of activities to counteract those biases that you may have.
I love it. Be intentional and call a thing a thing. Let's stop Let's stop moving around it and let's just call a thing a thing.
Well, in my old I say old black church because it's been a while since I've gone to this one, but they used to say name it and claim it. I'm like,
Yes.
hallelujah, amen.
I'm curious. So, Crystal, in your organization, do you still do unconscious bias? Have you seen it be maybe a successful, if done right, starter in any sort of change within an organization?
I think it's a great starter. In my organization, we don't have a unconscious bias training. So we have inclusion training. We actually have a race awareness type of training that we leverage as well. And then we do a training where it helps people to be more comfortable having conversations that are difficult to have. So around topics of inclusion and diversity, how do we bring everyone to the table to have that conversation, and we can agree to disagree. We can have productive conversation, even if we have differing opinions. Obviously, those differing opinions or values must be in alignment with the organization's values. But we don't so much focus on unconscious bias. As Kazike mentioned, it's a conduit, it's a starter of the conversation to say, hey, this is happening, it's part of the human condition. However, this is what you need to do to act to mitigate that thing. And again, calling a thing a thing. So all of the isms that exist, racism, heterosexism, cissexism, whatever we're talking about, whatever ism, we call it what it is, and we talk about strategies to mitigate those things.
Can I add something? I think one of the things I want, maybe I've articulated this, and if I have already, be patient with me. But I think the reason why unconscious bias training has become so important, because in these conversations we've been having over the last 10, 20, 30 more years, is this theme around white guilt, right? And the off-putting experience people have had with some trainings in the past. They go to a diversity training and they come in and they say, you need to accept you're racist or you're sexist. And we're like, oh, I could never be sexist. My mom's a woman. I could never be racist. My best friend is black. And so we have this guilt and all these things that we're trying to navigate. And here comes unconscious bias, and they're saying, well, it's not your fault. It's your brain.
Right.
It's broke.
So it's more comfortable.
Yes, so it makes us feel less guilt, less shame, and it's off-putting. And I get that. From a marketing perspective, from a team training opportunity, I am looking for something that's going to not feel as abrasive, because people have had too many experiences where I remember a client I had who got messed up because they started asking questions. You know the exercise where you're supposed to take a step forward if you've been in prison or someone who's been in prison, and they're like, there's no way I could talk about my prison life at work. And so they were offended and walked away angry and upset. And so I think we, in the field, have tried to look for something that doesn't feel quite as abrasive so folks feel part of the fold, right? And I get that. But I think there are other approaches that can approach that issue, but also having some tough conversations about what is it like when you're feeling that sense of abrasion and being pushed or all the things that people often, and I say this as a man who have to sit in rooms talking about issues around gender and feeling kind of pushed and anxious and guilty about all a number of things. But there are approaches to have those conversations versus just focusing on unconscious bias.
Yeah, that's a great
I
point.
love that you brought up that exercise. I'm sorry, Samantha.
Oh, no, go.
I love that you brought up that exercise. It's called like the privilege walk. I guess that's the general name of it. We actually do that exercise, but we usually have people close their eyes and raise their hands. So then people feel more comfortable participating in that activity. And if anyone on the call plans to do this activity, or if it happens to happen that it happens at your organization in the future, please know that you should only raise your hand or participate if you feel comfortable. You shouldn't have to do it if you don't feel comfortable doing it, but people are more likely to participate if they're able to do it in a way where everyone's not staring at them.
Interesting point around making something like required versus voluntary. And I wonder if you guys have thoughts on, I think as an HR professional, and we're excited to create change, and we have new trainings and new conversations. What are your thoughts on making something required or voluntary, and hopefully peer pressure and leadership help bring everyone together? Have you seen that work, not work? What's your general recommendation?
BK, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, it's always a juggling act of sorts, because you want. I prefer to work with the willing. Let's just put it out there. I prefer to work with the willing, because we're not going to spend gobs of time making the business case for why this is important. I don't have to send them a bunch of articles about why this is the thing you should do. I'm not going to I don't have to spend time talking about the profits and all that stuff. They're the willing, and they're like, let's do this. Now it's a conversation about what path we're going to take, and I love that. And so the assumption is I'm always going to have about 10% of any organization who are not going to just be resistant, but are going to dig their heels in. And that's okay. That's the challenge, is that it's okay, because that's the nature of humans, right? You're going to have a range of folks who are getting different levels of acceptance of anything that's new and changing of the culture of an organization, or buying into a different concept. I think the challenge is that being available when those folks are ready to kind of lean into this conversation, to be a part of it, that you're providing skills for them to be a part of a conversation, even if their position is, I don't want to do this, but they're still invited and have a way of engaging the conversation when possible. Because oftentimes people, it's not that they don't want to do it, sometimes they don't have the information about where they fit into this conversation. There's a lot of things. And so what I oftentimes offer is a conversation about stages of change. And for a lot of people, they have certain values, beliefs, where they may be. It may take them 6 months of doing some research and some exploration before they decide they want to even buy in the first place. Or they may not even know there's a problem. There's a problem. The racism is an issue, really? And so if you're coming from that perspective of less judgment and more of how they fit on the spectrum and being available to them when they're ready, it's not about resistance. And I guess maybe that comes from my background working in alcohol and drug treatment. You're going to get a lot of people who are going to be like, I don't have a problem with drugs. I see you getting high all the time, but okay. And so from that perspective of stages of change, you just accept that people are in different places, and that's okay. I do know that sometimes it becomes a challenge because, let's say you're dealing with leadership, right? And you only have like 7, 8, 9, 10 people, and you need all the buy-in you can get. And there's that one person, or maybe 2 people, maybe it's even your leader, who's like, we're spending how much money on this? I don't know about that. And you almost have to take a little bit of the same kind of mindset, because even if it's the leader and all the rest of their team is saying yes, at some point the leadership has to ask themselves, why is the rest of my team on board and I'm not? So then that's when I go back to those, how do you have conversations about this conversation, this subject matter? And I think if you build the tools to have the conversation, eventually what you're going to see is how this is aligned with the business case, how this is aligned with the mission, so on and so forth. And you give people the time necessary, because people sometimes just need time to adjust. You never know what's going on in people's lives, that makes it difficult for them to process this really weighty, heavy stuff. Hence why, and again, I'll plug the reason we developed the game that we came up with, because it gave people a fun, interactive way of having conversations about something that's typically touchy. And now I can actually have a conversation about it without feeling the angst that we oftentimes feel.
That's great advice. Thank you.
Totally agree. I would definitely say that making recommendations, inviting everyone in to participate is really important. And what's also important is that leadership is on board. So you have a C-suite at your organization, you have the CEO, their direct reports. Have they been involved in crafting this inclusion strategy or approach to creating a more inclusive environment? If so, and they've bought into that, which they should have, because that's a very important part of the work, piece of the work, in order to make sure that things move forward, then they are also involved in making sure and recommending that their leaders and the leaders that report to those leaders are attending these trainings and workshops and really understand the why behind it.
That's a perfect lead into my next question.
Before we get there, Samantha,
yeah.
can I just give a really good example of why that's important? For those who know me, know that I work part-time for the mayor of Austin. And if I can get the mayor of Austin to go to a 2-hour training, I mean, not 2 hour, 2-day training with his schedule, then anyone should go to a training. There is no excuse. And it made a huge difference when you had the mayor of Austin coming in, talking to bankers and nonprofit leaders and his friends, saying, hey, if I can find 2 days to do this, you can too. And that's such a much more powerful message than, well, you should do it.
Absolutely. So my next question is around, so again, for HR folks that are maybe in the beginning stages of our building change within our organizations, what are some of the obstacles, mistakes that you see companies make as they kind of start these conversations within their organizations?
Ooh, so I'll bring up a couple. So a couple of mistakes that I've seen in the past at previous organizations is, one, doing things because Microsoft, Facebook, all the FANG companies are doing it, and we're just like, we need to do it too because they're also doing it. Don't do that. When you do that, those things are empty because there's not something that you're trying to achieve through doing those particular things. So what's really important is to gather data, to understand what are the gaps and opportunities at your organization. What are you doing really well at your organization? Because then that will assist you in developing what strategy do we need to focus on as an organization? What custom things do we need to do as an organization to move us forward? Because if you do all the things that all the other companies are doing, it's not really attached to anything. It's not really driving any particular outcomes. So if, for example, you notice that your retention for women is low, so attrition is very high for women, you need to understand why that is. What is the root cause that women are leaving this organization? Don't just go out and create a sponsorship program or go out and create a mentorship program, but you really have to understand what is the root cause of these gaps and opportunities. How can I address them in a custom way that benefits my workforce at my particular organization?
I really like those examples, Crystal. I was smiling because I was like, amen. I'll add that one of the other big mistakes is that, with the unfortunate circumstances with George Floyd's death and those movements we've seen around the pandemic as far as the coronavirus and institutional racism and kind of awareness around that, organizations have decided, okay, we're going to hire someone. And the mistake they make is to throw that person somewhere kind of lost in the organizational chart, right? The person has no money, no authority, no flexibility, no degrees of freedom to do the work that needed done. And oftentimes they hide them somewhere in HR. And I'm of the mindset that you need to have a person who has a direct link to leadership, who's not just executive, but is enterprise level leadership, who is intended to be there over a duration, whose part of the job description is about culture change. Yes, they'll be working closely with HR and communications and other folks, but they're their own division. That approach, even if it's just one person in your organization, in whatever size, and you say, we need to hire someone, make sure that that person is reporting directly to your CEO or executive director. And they're involved, and then over a period of time, there's a plan of how do that person, as far as leading that division, work with other departments, but also how do they build the budget and the resources to do what they need to do? Because if you put a person in that position with no authority and no money, then you're really sabotaging them. And when I start off with organization, I said, what you need to be looking at is 1% of your profits as a commitment to this work. Now, people will freak out and be like, 1%. But, anytime you build a building or anytime you've done anything big as far as a project concerned that changes the culture of an organization, it's required money. So now we need to think about how we apply this. But what's not being said, and the mistake we make, is not acknowledging that, in truth, we really didn't value it in the way it needed to be valued in the first place. And so now we need to have a conversation about why this is important. But again, that number one mistake is thinking this is something you just kind of hide in recruitment or hide in supply chain diversity or something like that, and with no connection to leadership at all. That's a big, big mistake.
That leads me to the question of, show me the money. Clearly, if leadership is engaged, they will invest. And to me, that's a major red flag. But are there other ways? And I'm curious because you go into organizations, and how do you gauge how serious they are, how committed they are to doing the work?
Resources come in different forms, right? There's resources as far as, intellect and knowledge, and there's time is a huge resource. There's money, right? And so when I'm sitting at my coffers, I'm imagining this treasure trove, right? And I'm looking at all the treasures I have in front of me. I'm going to be looking at all those categories and then some, right? And so let's say we don't have the budget this year, and I just been hired as a consultant or in this position that I just described earlier, and now I need to figure out who in the organization are my co-conspirators who are committed to this work. Because if I'm doing this in isolation, in a vacuum, I'm not going to get anything done. Because there's going to be, I'm assuming most people are going to love me, but there's going to be a lot of people who don't, because of things the uncomfortable conversations I'm creating. Maybe they just don't like me as a person. Whatever, it doesn't matter. I need to have co-conspirators who are going to be also champions for this work. But that's a resource, because now I'm asking them not just to commit their ideals to this, but I actually need their time. And I need time that's during work hours, not just in the evening during lunch meetings. But that's a resource that I can now cultivate and working throughout the organization to create the kind of change I'm looking for. And so those are the kinds of things I'm looking for. Even if I don't have dollars in front of me, I'm looking for time, I'm looking for intellect, I'm looking for expertise, I'm looking for leadership to come in and make things happen. And so when I do run into that person who says, I'm not going to do this, I can look at my leadership and say, hey, Johnny, Susie, Kwame says he's not going to do anything. Can you go talk to them for me? And it's more likely to happen. Even if they do it begrudgingly, they'll go through the motions at minimum.
What I would also add to that, and those were really great examples, is that it's really important for organizations, when we talk about time, for organizations to realize that this work takes time. So you won't be able to fix it all in 90 days. Not going to happen. However, if you are an organization that doesn't have the funds available, look at the bright side for this. And it really goes back to the last response that I had about data. If you don't have the money, it's not going to cost you anything to really understand the ins and outs of your organization. Who's coming into the organization? Who's progressing in this organization? And who's leaving? Who do I need to have conversations with to gather qualitative data? What systems do we have available right now that I can look at quantitative data? So an engagement survey, for example. Are you looking at those scores and desegregating the data by gender, by ethnicity, and however else your organization can break that information down? Because that's really going to help you build a foundation of understanding, where is my organization today? What does good look like? And how are we going to get there? So definitely take the time, if you don't have the budget, to do the work that it takes to approach these issues in a custom way for your organization.
Can I say amen to you again, Crystal? Because that, again, the money thing always becomes a thing that becomes a barrier. But the things you're talking about are part of several people's job description today. And it's something you may add as part of your survey, right? It may be something, some interviews that you were already going to have, that you were going to add a few questions around this subject matter. It's the low-hanging fruit is there. It's just your willingness to do it becomes actually the real question. One of the things I remember getting pushback on was, well, I don't think we can ask questions about race. It's against the rules. Well, show me where it's written. Well, I think it's against the law. Well, show me the law. We just never done that before. Okay, well, now it's a change. You know, you just have to sit through the fire sometimes to get the simple things I think Crystal just described done. Because again, what we're talking about is culture change. And that's sometimes hard for people when you're asking them to do things differently.
Yeah. Hold firm. Keep asking why, like a 2-year-old. Why? Why? To get to the bottom, as you mentioned, so then we can just move on because the things need to be done. And if you are an organization who's a federal contractor, you're required to collect that information and you're able to leverage it to understand where are we doing well and where do we need to improve. And you can use that information to inform the actions that you're going to take moving forward. One other thing that we talked about offline was about pulling people in the organization. And I know that with the accelerated movement that's been happening around Black Lives Matter, post the murder of George Floyd, there's been a lot of leveraging Black employees in the organization to do the work. And I would really challenge you to rethink that. So in what other ways can you do the work without burdening your Black employees to do the work for you, especially if they are not being compensated? So consider how, one, can we compensate these folks within our organizations who are doing the work? Can we hire someone? Is there some other way that we can get the knowledge that we need to move forward? And obviously groups like this, free to join, you're able to get lots of information and gain a lot of knowledge to understand how you might move forward.
That was my next question.
I'm upset, Samantha, because I feel like I should have known Crystal 100 years ago. Because
well, now you guys know each other.
I'm just excited. I'm like, oh, I know this sister. So we have to get connected, girl.
We do.
Oh, this makes me so happy. Actually, I want to do a quick poll only because Crystal actually knew my next question. I was going to ask about the burden of using your underrepresented talent within the organization or even outsourcing that work to them. Unpaid, it's a lot of extra time. And I'm just kind of curious, the question in the poll is more about like, where are we as a group? So as HR professionals in Austin, where is your organization in that kind of DEI journey? So, and there's no wrong answer. We're all at different places. Have you maybe not started the conversation? Basic is maybe an unconscious bias training. I would say advanced or expert is really, there's funding, it's operationalized in your strategy, it's part of your culture. That might just help shape some of and I know it probably depends whether you're a smaller or larger organization and some of the funding, but I'm really curious. All right, I'm going to close the poll. We have about 5 seconds. A couple people haven't voted. I can see you. Okay. Awesome. So 57%, so the majority by large, I would say, are definitely basic. Would love to hear, questions later on about kind of how to get started, since the majority of us are in that kind of none to basic area. So that just wanted to share that a little bit with our speakers. Getting started without necessarily having funding. I'm curious.
Hey, Samantha, I'm sorry, I couldn't see the results. Could you put them on the screen? I didn't see them. Did I miss them, or? I'm sorry.
Did anybody see the results, or did I not share it correctly?
No, it doesn't look like it.
Darn. Okay. It was only me looking at them? Harold, you can't give me rights to Zoom anymore. It was definitely none to basic were the highest. And then we had the third largest group was intermediate. So I'm losing my earbuds, hold on. So I apologize, I don't know how to make the poll reappear. And sharing my screen's not gonna help, sorry. Oh, good, thank you, Angie. You'll know how to fix that behind the scenes for me. Starting with starting with no money, and then having to rely in-house on your talent. And I know there are free networks and peer groups to help you. I am a little bit curious. Have you seen anybody reward and recognize that talent that's doing the work internally successfully? Because I do feel like there's probably a lot of value in engaging those people that want to do the work because they're passionate about your company and about their experience. What are some things that we could do as HR professionals to help bring attention and really reward and recognize those individuals? And that's maybe Crystal to start.
Sure. That's actually a really great question. I think that if your organization doesn't have any money, consider how those people who are really involved in some sort of official capacity, whether they're ambassadors or champions or ERG leaders, whomever, how can you take a look at their goals, their annual goals for the year, their performance review? How do you embed inclusion into those goals? How do you have conversations with their managers to talk about how this particular work related to driving an inclusive culture within the organization supports the organization at large? So we need to add, 15% of their role needs to focus on X, Y, and Z to get them to 100%. So it shouldn't be 100% of your role is your actual job, and then 15% on top of that is this work, but it should actually be included in that person's role if you don't have the funds. Now, if you have some funds to be able to compensate people, please do. A lot of organizations, tech companies in general, have bonus periods or areas of the year or times in the year where they award equity. How can you award equity to those people who have been champions, who have been ambassadors, who have led employee resource groups and really driven a lot of impact? How can you consider those folks when you're considering end of year compensation? And again, talking about the work that they've done in their performance review, in the conversations that you're having with them on a quarterly basis. How are you incorporating the work that they're doing to drive an inclusive culture in those conversations? And how are you getting them into rooms with people who are decision makers and stakeholders? Because at that point, you're increasing their visibility in the organization. So you're not only supporting your goal of driving a more inclusive culture, but you're also connecting them in ways where they may not have been connected before. So then people who are decision makers are really able to see how brilliant they are. And I guarantee that those folks are more than deserving of promotions and progressing within your organization.
That's great.
I don't have much to add. I think everything Crystal mentioned, I think, are really great ideas. The only thing I would add is in your communications through the organization and externally to others who are, who buy into the brand that may represent your organization, and giving people their kudos. I think everything that Crystal mentioned is very important, because making it part of your job and getting credit for it as part of your job is important. But sometimes celebrating those achievements internally from a communications perspective, but also externally, can be another way of just, giving people their, their gold watch now, or give you your flowers now versus waiting until later, and showcasing that in some way. That can be a really powerful tool as well.
I want to circle back on data. So I think Crystal mentioned data as like a great starting point. I've experienced that sometimes data is a barrier. What data do we collect? Are we comparing ourselves to the Googles and everything and Facebooks? When do we have enough data? What data is important? What data is not important? I loved our conversation offline. Could you kind of pick that back up again for the group a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So I would say there's a difference between benchmarking data and organizational data. Hopefully, most organizations are beyond this part of having the conversation of, why is diversity important? Why is it important for us to have women on our leadership team? Why is it important for us to have racial and ethnic diversity in leadership? Hopefully, most organizations are beyond that. If your organization is not, then you may still be having those types of conversations. But I do think that at some point, you have to combine that benchmarking type of data with what's going on in our organization. How are the things that are going on in our organization related to some of the things that are going on externally, and what is our plan to act? When we think about the data that we use organizationally, I think it's really important to have conversations, as we mentioned before, with people who are responsible for those things as their job. So talent acquisition, for example, are they actually taking a look at their recruiting funnel? Do they know where underrepresented talent is falling out of the funnel? Are they all at the top, or are they never even applying? So then you understand, how do we approach addressing that? Do you have a talent development department or learning and development department that's responsible for engagement and development of talent? Have conversations with them about promotion data or about what they're seeing in the work that they're doing. Or when people are leaving the organization, who is the key stakeholder that's involved there? What are they seeing? What are they hearing? And how can we address those things? Bottom line is that benchmarking data should not prohibit you from doing the work. And if you feel like it is, start to incorporate the data from your organization to help people understand what's going on here. All of that pie in the sky stuff that's going on outside of our organization is great, but we need to address the things that are happening within the organization so we can drive towards a more inclusive culture and a place where people can do their best work, a place where people want to come and that they want to stay.
Awesome. And there, eventually, when you do have org data, my assumption is, I'm making an assumption. Let's just say you're in an organization and you realize that, gosh, our females or Black employees, whatever underrepresented talent group we want to focus on, this initiative, it's probably a smaller group than the majority. And I feel like as HR professionals, we are trained to build something that works for many, as opposed to being targeted for smaller groups within the organization. Have you come across resistance to spending a lot of money or taking a lot of time on an initiative that speaks to maybe much smaller parts of the organization? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And I think this happens every day at many organizations where they say, well, we only have 10 Black employees, or we only have 20 women. So why would we do X thing? And I think it's really important for people to understand that what we do for the most marginalized talent or the most marginalized benefits everyone. So if you take step A, it's not just going to benefit this particular group, it's going to have an effect on the entire organization, not just this one set of people. I think another thing that I like to say is that equality isn't pie, because I think a lot of people feel that once you bring other people in, once you ensure that there's equal opportunity, equal access, that you're taking something away from the majority group. And that's actually not true. It's not a zero-sum game. Equality is not pie. So again, what we do for the most marginalized groups only benefits the organization as a whole. And if we have the key stakeholders really understanding how these actions are going to benefit everyone, I think that's really going to raise the tide in the organization and help you to move forward faster.
Great. I want to move, I had a couple questions in the chat just because I cannot believe 45 minutes has gone by already, and I want to just stay on the line with y'all all day. So one question that came up as a white male, how do I get involved with champion change in my organization? What does that look like? What are some steps that I could do to help move the needle?
I think one of the things is acknowledging that many women and people of color have too long have been overburdened by this responsibility. And so I would say I welcome white men and women who are saying they want to take a leadership role on this. I think the challenge sometimes that you're going to have to navigate is that, I guess, let me just tell you a brief story. I remember the first time I went to a women's leadership feminist event. And the tendency for men to show up when they show up at those events is they want to kind of take over the conversation. That's just how we're kind of, you know, we're raised to be like. And one of the things I learned in being that experience and learned several things since is that sometimes when I enter a space like that, I need to wait to be invited. I need to be okay and comfortable being a second fiddle or taking a back seat. And I give that to, if you're a white male, the same kind of mindset. That all too often we're enthusiastic and want to make something happen, but we think we should be at the lead. When we should be sitting back, maybe I can use my privilege to invite other people to be part of this conversation who are overwhelmed and tired by this conversation because they're always the person they go to for these topics. Maybe I need to be going to find out who in my organization has already been doing this and what I can do to support their efforts versus me taking a lead on this. And so I'm saying that from the perspective of how do I use my privilege in a positive way versus it actually creating the same kind of challenges I was trying to avoid in the first place. So if as a male, I have to be mindful of that all the time when I work on the spaces. And I would say as a white man, you have to be mindful of what does it mean to be a white man in these spaces trying to have these conversations. And for some reason or another, you find yourself taking the lead on it. Is there someone else who's been talking about this already that you need to support and push them up to the front and be the hype man for them? I would love to have a hype man for the conversations I have, where I could be like, yeah, and then someone says, yeah. You know, if you could be their hype man, that would be a beautiful thing, because then their voice doesn't get diminished oftentimes. You hear these stories from the women who worked with Obama, how they would strategize with one another and talk about how we're going to support one another when we get diminished by one of the men or other people in the room. And we're going to actually strategize and support one another. And that might be one role you serve that doesn't look like me leading it, but actually supporting what's already going on. So that's something to be mindful of as you're kind of looking at your role and how you might help to push this initiative forward in your organization. Hopefully I answer that question.
I'm looking for a hype man or a hype person.
Hype person, yes.
Where are you? I love that so much. I don't have anything to add really, but what I'll say is that Samantha mentioned in the beginning of the conversation that I have a podcast, and our episode that airs tomorrow is called It's Our Duty. And we're having a conversation with a Black man who talked about how Black and brown, or how men need to show up for Black and brown women. And then there was a part in the conversation that we talked about Jay-Z and his 444 album, where he talked about how he really didn't understand the issues that women were going through until he had a daughter. And I won't ruin the whole conversation or dialogue for you, but basically the point is that that's kind of a cop-out to say that I don't really know, I don't see you as human until I have a daughter. That's unacceptable. So it's really important for people to stand up as allies, because we can all be allies to someone, standing up to amplify their voices, to be their hype people, whatever it is that they need, especially if they've been the ones doing the work already, and asking yourself, how do I support them and how do I center the voices of underrepresented talent, of marginalized communities? Because in that way, if I am to do that, all of us do benefit.
Love that. We have about 10 minutes left. I want to open it up to questions. While you guys are coming up with your questions, I have two more quick things. I know it's housekeeping. One, thoughts on going back to that question around kind of being a white male and helping with change. Any thoughts on like allyship curriculum within organizations, like teaching employees to understand what it means to use your privilege and help and stand up? Is that almost more important or helpful than maybe being aware of bias in some of these organizations?
I think it's all important. Yeah. I think it's all part of the journey. It's all part of moving forward. You have to understand, what am I doing unconsciously? And then as an ally, how do I act on those things? And the things that I decide to act on, the things that I believe are important, should be things that the population or the person who I'm trying to elevate also feels is important, because allyship is a verb. It's not a noun. You can't be a self-proclaimed ally, but those underrepresented folks that you're supporting and amplifying are the ones who refer to you as an ally. And you really do, as I mentioned before, have to center their needs. If you find that the things that you're doing are centering you, or centering your guilt, as we talked about in the beginning of the conversation, then you want to go back to the drawing board, because the things that you do must center the marginalized communities.
Yeah, I have nothing to add. I had a thought and it just left me.
Any last words of advice to our HR professionals on the call? Again, the secret poll that apparently I only saw the results, the majority of the call, we are at the very beginning of our journey within our organizations. There's so many valuable pointers and tips throughout this conversation, but any last words of advice, as hopefully we are all inspired and brave enough to, keep the momentum going in our organizations?
I would say, I would like to remind folks, even if you're at the beginning of this race, or at least you feel like you are, you're here to build the emotional, physical, intellectual muscles necessary for this work, because this is a long-term investment in a relationship with people that you don't even know right now, who are not even on your radar, but are going to be part of the process of your growth and development as you do your own self-exploration, as you investigate and explore what's going on in your organization, as you're faced with things that you never thought you would have to be dealing with at this time and age, but you're going to be like needing support and build relationships with people. I would encourage you to reach out to your networks of people who are doing this work already, and support and doing things that you probably haven't done before. If you happen to be white, one of the things that this is dated research, but a lot of white Americans don't have any other networks outside of white community. And so for some of y'all, it may be going out and actually making not just an acquaintance with a person of color, but actually developing a relationship over a period of time, not with necessarily the purpose of becoming more racially aware or whatever, but to build your network, with people who are doing and living this life of a person of color or whatever it may be in a really meaningful way, and be invested over a long period of time. Because if you're thinking this is something to be, as mentioned before by Crystal, something can be done in a couple of months, then you're fooling yourself. But really be invested in this, make a commitment to this on a regular basis. When I mean regular, every week, if not every day, really committing and recommitting. It's kind of like losing weight, you lost 10 pounds and then you're like, oh, I'm good. And then you're like, a few weeks go by, you're like, oh, I need to recommit to this. But really continually make that commitment. I would highly encourage and build those relationships with people in a really meaningful, deep way, so you can move in a direction that I think will probably be to your benefit and the benefit of others.
So the things that I would add, those were amazing. What I would add first is breathe, because it's a lot. Like, you can't boil the ocean. So you have to consider, what can I tackle today? What are the steps in the progress? And the first step, as I mentioned before, should always be data. What is going on in my organization? What are the gaps and opportunities? What are we doing well? What do I need to approach in order to center those marginalized communities, that underrepresented talent? You got this. And then the last thing would be, always be learning. So it's so important to realize in this work that you have to have humility. None of us know everything. I've been doing this work for a while. I'm sure many of you have been doing HR work, DEI work for a very long time. And I'm sure you're always learning something new. So you have to be open-minded. You have to be open-minded to the fact that your view and your experience isn't the only experience. There may be someone sitting right next to you who's having a totally different experience with Bob than you've had. So you really have to believe the person who's telling you, I'm having this particular experience. This is what my opportunity is. Can you support me in this thing? to really have that opportunity, the real opportunity, to center these communities to move your organization forward on the inclusive or the inclusive environment or workplace continuum.
Awesome. Thank you so much. There's some housekeeping in the chat. So just, Angie, keep me honest on what I'm missing. Reminder that our next event is the continuous performance management. We'll also have invites out soon. We've posted Crystal's link to her podcast and her site. There's been requests for that. Kazike, feel free to add. I think you sent a link earlier with, I think the link to your cards, right? Awesome. And a leadership seminar, is that right? Am I reading that link right? Angie? Awesome, okay. Susan, I'm gonna turn it over to you quickly. We have some really great giveaways that, so Susan from Inspirity, one of our amazing sponsors, these were book picks by our panelists, and we're really excited to be having some giveaways today. So, I thought I saw Susan on the call.
Here.
Oh, there she is, sorry.
Hi.
There's so many people, this is amazing. I'll let you go ahead.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for some great moderation of a great conversation. And Crystal and Kazik, I hope I didn't mispronounce your name. Thank you so much. It was such an elevating conversation, and you know, it brings to my mind a lot of thoughts around what our company does and what we do for our clients. So thanks again for all your insights. We do have some great gifts here. Thank you for the book suggestions. The winners are of the first book, Subtle Acts of Exclusion, Amanda Nastopil. Forgive me if I mispronounce, but the next book is Stamped from the Beginning, and the winner is Ashley Fairley. Congrats to both of you. The third book is called Black Fatigue. The winner is Movisha Salter. And the last giveaway, thank you, I think also Kazik, we are giving away some of your cards to Kyle Shearer, Cards for Belonging and Inclusion. So congrats to everybody. I'm so thrilled for you, those of you that won. And so I am putting my email in the chat box. If you will just email me a mailing address, I'll get these out to you sooner than later, and I hope you thoroughly enjoy them. Lastly, speakers, please look for a little thank you gift in the mail from Insperity as well. Thank you again.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Angie, any last words? I want to thank Crystal and Kazike so much. This has been an amazing discussion. This is, I think, our highest attended event since COVID, since we moved online. I do miss seeing everybody live in the joint offices. So it just speaks to me that we can come together as an HR community and create change. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
so
and I would
much.
say we're gifted to have you guys in our community. Sam, if you have a couple other polls you wanna launch, you're welcome to. For those of you that need the SHRM PDU, stand by. I'm gonna post it now. Don't drop until you get that. But we're gonna stand by if there's a couple of last minute questions you all have. Otherwise, you can drop as soon as I post that code in.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you.
Congrats.
Yeah, congrats on the new house.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Bye.
exciting. Take care, y'all.
Grabbing that code now. Serious multitasking.
I know, I thought I had it up and I don't.